The trapper came up the ridge road on the 4th of December, 1891, in a slouch hat gone dark with snow along its brim, his horse picking careful steps through the drifted ruts. He had made the ride from town, half expecting to find the place abandoned, the way such places tended to go, out on the sandhill ridge, when a woman was left alone to manage ground that the county had already written off once. What he found instead made him pull the horse to a stop at the crest of the road and sit there a long moment without dismounting. Beside a low cedar door set into the hillside, nailed to a post driven clean into the frozen ground, hung a board. Not a rough thing, a planed board, whitewashed, with lettering done in careful black ink. He was close enough now to read it. 7 names, 7 figures in the column beside them, and at the bottom a total rendered in the same unhurried hand. $1 per barrel equivalent. 7 families. The arithmetic was plain, and it did not flatter him. She was seated just inside the doorway of the small house at the edge of the clearing, visible through the window glass, as a shape bent over a table, a ledger open before her, a candle set to one side. She did not look up immediately. When she did, it was without surprise, the way a woman looks up from a column of figures when she has already heard the horse on the road and has chosen to finish her line before acknowledging company. She rose and came to the door, and she was 26 years old, and she looked it, and she looked also like something that had been tested by this ground and had not broken. He stood in the snow. He held his hat in both hands, which was not a thing he had planned to do. From somewhere beside the low cedar door came a sound, a dry collective rustling, the particular industry of small animals in cedar shavings, and he looked and saw the long hutch built against the hillside, and he understood that some portion of the animals he had sold her were still alive in there, fat, by the look of the pelts moving in the gaps of the hutch boards. He had sold them as good for nothing but skinning. He had been privately amused by the transaction. That amusement had a different quality now, standing in the cold, hat in hand, reading 7 names on a whitewashed board. She said nothing to him yet. She simply watched him understand what he was looking at, and she gave him the time to do it properly. 2 years and 8 months earlier, in the wet April of 1889, this ground had sold for $12 at the Cherry County tax sale. The county assessor had described it in his ledger as wind-shifted sandhill acreage, marginal for any conventional purpose. He had not been wrong about the ground. He had only been wrong about what could be done with it. He had not been wrong about the ground. He had only been wrong about what could be done with it. 2 years and 8 months before, he stood in the December cold, reading 7 names on a whitewashed board. The ground itself had been struck from the county rolls, for failure of taxes owed, 3 seasons of assessments unpaid by a succession of men who had tried the acreage and abandoned it, each leaving behind only their frustration and a few rotting fence posts. The Cherry County tax sale was held on the 2nd Thursday of April, 1889, in the assessor's office, which smelled of coal smoke and damp wool. The morning was cold for the season, the sandhills still showing last winter's pale grass across their flanks. And the sale drew perhaps a dozen men, some serious bidders, most merely curious, the way men are curious about the misfortune catalogued in public records. She was the only woman present. She had come in from the ridge road on foot, which was itself a statement, though she did not intend it as one. She was 24 years old, 4 months out of mourning for a husband who had died of fever in December, and she had $31 and some few cents to her name, the whole of what he had left, which was not much, but which she had accounted carefully, as was her habit. She wore her good coat, which was not a fine coat, and she carried a small ledger book in which she had already written down the parcel number, the acreage, and the county's description of the land. Wind-drifted sandpan subsoil, unfit for corn or sod breaking. She had read those words in the county notice and had not been discouraged by them. She had, rather, written them down because she believed that a thing carefully noted was a thing half understood, and understanding was where she always began. The assessor read the parcel aloud with the particular flatness of a man reciting an inventory of items already judged worthless. 60 acres, Sand Hill Ridge, Cherry County. The grain merchant, who stood near the back wall with his hands behind him, said something low to the man beside him, and both smiled. The assessor asked for an opening bid, and there was a brief, comfortable silence. The silence of men who have already decided a thing is not worth their time. She bid $12. No one countered. The assessor wrote her name in his ledger with the mechanical efficiency of a man recording a transaction he expects to see reversed inside of 18 months. The grain merchant watched her accept the deed receipt and said nothing aloud, but the look he exchanged with the assessor was a full sentence. Easily read, she does not know what she has done. She knew precisely what she had done. She had spent $12 of her $31 on 60 acres of ground that no one else wanted, which meant it was ground that had not yet been asked the right questions. She walked back out into the cold April morning and turned toward the ridge. He came up the ridge road 3 days after the tax sale, in the slow, unhurried way of a man who holds the advantage in a transaction and knows it. His wagon carried a long wooden crate, slatted on the sides, and from within it came a low, continuous sound, not quite a chirr, not quite a hiss, the sound of animals awake and restless in confined space. He had driven out from the creek settlement, where he kept his trapping lines, and he had stopped first at the grain merchant's to ask after the woman who had bought the Sandhill parcel. And the grain merchant had given him directions with a particular kind of generosity that suggested he found the errand amusing. She was at the property already, walking the acreage in the late morning light. There was not much to walk, 60 acres of wind-combed grass and loose sand, a few bur oak scrub along the eastern edge, and the sky enormous and indifferent above it all. She heard the wagon before she saw it, and waited at the edge of the track. He was a lean man of middle years, with the deliberate economy of movement that belongs to men who work alone outdoors and have learned not to waste themselves. He climbed down from the wagon box and explained his errand without preliminary. He had 60 ferrets he could not place with any hunting outfit in the county. Black-footed, sandhill bred, most of them past 5 years, old for working ferrets, and sand-blind to a degree that made them unreliable for the bolt and flush work the rabbit hunters required. He had been carrying them through the spring, hoping for a buyer. He wanted $4.50 for the lot, which he said plainly was not the pelt's worth come November, but was what a man asks when he is tired of feeding animals he cannot use. She did not answer immediately. She walked around the crate and looked through the slats for a long time. The ferrets inside moved with a certain purposefulness despite the close quarters, noses working along the wood grain, bodies low and fluid. Their eyes, where she could see them, had the pale, milky cast of creatures whose vision had been worn down by years of sandhill grit. But their noses did not stop. Even in the box, even in the strange air of a new place, the noses were reading the world with a steady, unhurried attention that she recognized as something other than blindness. It looked, she thought, more like a different kind of sight. She paid him $4.50 from the fold of bills she kept in her coat. He drove back down the Ridge Road and stopped again at the grain merchant's, as she perhaps suspected he would. By the following afternoon, the story had traveled in the efficient way that stories travel in small counties. The grain merchant's wife to the Halverson woman, the Halverson woman to the Dressen wife on the Creek Road, and the assessment, when it arrived back at its origin, was unanimous. She had spent half her remaining money on blind animals and cursed ground, and there was nothing more to be said. The morning after the story had finished its circuit through the county, she carried the traveling crate to the near slope of the acreage and opened its latch in the early light. There was no ceremony to it. The ferrets did not pour out in a rush as she had half expected. They came out the way water moves through sand, one at a time, then in pairs, threading between her boots and spreading across the pale, root-thin grass with a low, purposeful silence. She stood still and watched them go. Some turned back immediately and pressed their noses to the earth. Some lifted their heads and worked the air in short, gathering arcs before dropping again to the ground. None of them ran blindly. That was the first thing she noticed and held. None of them ran blindly. She had not been at this long, 10 minutes, perhaps 15, when she heard the fence creak at the property line and looked over to find her neighbor standing there, one hand on the top rail, watching with the particular stillness of a man who has seen many mornings and wasted very few of them. He had homesteaded his adjacent 40 acres in 1871, nearly 2 decades before, and the sandhills had left their mark on him the way they leave their mark on cedar, drying him, graining him, making him harder and quieter and more permanently himself. He said nothing for a while. She did not fill the silence. The ferrets moved between them in their low, fluid way, noses never lifting far from the sand. "What do you make of it?" she asked at last, not asking for permission, not asking to be reassured, asking because she thought he might know something worth knowing. He watched a moment longer before he answered. "A blind animal trusts its nose over its eyes," he said. "Follow their noses, not their wandering." She turned this over. There was a difference, she understood him to mean, between the zigzag a frightened or aimless thing makes across open ground, and the returning arc of a creature reading something real beneath its feet. One was randomness. The other was information she had not yet learned to read. He touched the fence rail once and walked back toward his own land without elaborating. He did not need to. By the winter of 1891, most of those early stakes had darkened with 2 seasons of weather, their wood gone gray and soft at the tips from frost and thaw. A neighbor who came to rent cellar space that December, a farm wife from the Creek Road who had spoken her own low opinion of the ferret purchase some years before, paused beside one of them on her way up the ridge. It stood within 4 feet of the cellar door, half leaning in the frozen sand. The small cloth flag she had tied to it long since rotted away. The woman looked at it without understanding what it was. This weathered marker, this quiet record of an animal's nose at work. Then she looked at the cellar door beyond it, solid and deliberate in its cedar frame, and said nothing. The stake remained. The hollow had no name on any county map. It was not a draw, not a swale, not a crease of any dimension that would earn a surveyor's notation. It was simply a place where the sandhill surface sat differently, firmer than the surrounding ground, by some degree the foot could feel, but the eye could not quite explain. A subtle resistance underfoot, as though the sand there had forgotten how to shift. She found it first, In early June of 1889, following behind 3 of the older animals on an evening when the light came low and copper across the ridge. They moved toward the northwest corner of her acreage with a purposefulness she had by then learned to distinguish from ordinary ranging. She stood at the edge of the hollow and felt the ground beneath her boot soles and said nothing. She went home and opened her ledger. The entry for that evening was brief. Northwest quarter, approximately 40 yards from fence line. Firm. 3 animals, persistent digging, no prey sign. Over the 6 weeks that followed, she returned to that hollow so many times. The grass trace of her path became visible, a faint threading through the blowout sand. She brought the ledger every time. She recorded the date and the hour, and which of the animals. She had begun by then to distinguish the older ones by the particular gray freckling at their muzzles, had returned to the spot without her directing them there. Most days, at least 4. Some days, 8 or 9, nosing and scratching at a depth that produced no gopher, no rabbit, no sign of burrow below. She recorded the depth of their scratch marks with a length of knotted cord. She recorded when the digging was freshest. She recorded the direction from which they most often approached the hollow, and she noted that it was almost always from the east, as though something beneath the surface exhaled in that direction, and they could smell the exhalation. The town did not mock this. The town, by then, had simply stopped paying attention. Mockery requires ongoing interest, and her neighbors had spent theirs in the early weeks after the purchase, when the ferrets were still a subject worth discussing at the grain merchant's counter or between the rows at a church social. By June, they had moved on. She had become, in the community's quiet arithmetic, a settled case. A young widow of modest sense who had made a poor bargain and would likely sell the acreage by autumn at whatever the tax office would give her. 2 farm wives from the creek road had mentioned her situation to one another in tones of genuine pity, which is a colder thing than contempt. Pity requires no further watching. She watched enough for all of them. By the middle of July, the scratch marks in the northwest hollow had deepened by her knotted cord's measure to nearly 16 inches in one concentrated spot, and the sand there came away not as loose grit, but in flat, compressed panes, as though the ground beneath had been pressed once, long ago, from above. She began with the spade on the 21st of July, in the hour before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, when the sand was still cool enough to hold the impression of a boot heel. She had chosen this time deliberately. By 8 o'clock, the sand hills gathered heat, the way a cast-iron pan gathers it, gradually, then all at once, and a woman working with a mattock in July's full light would spend half her strength simply remaining upright. So she rose before first color and walked the hollow in the gray of early morning, the ferrets stirring in their cedar hutch as she passed, their blunt noses lifted, their clouded eyes turning toward the sound of her footfall as though they recognized it. Which, she had come to believe, they did. The first 2 days she removed loose sand. That was all it was. Removal, a slow, patient subtraction, the spade cutting down through grit that fell away almost willingly, and the wheelbarrow she'd borrowed from the German neighbor, accepting load after load without complaint. She kept the excavation narrow, no wider than her shoulders, conserving effort. She had measured the spot with her knotted cord and marked its corners with stakes, and she worked within that measured square with the same arithmetic she applied to everything. Only what was necessary, nothing wasted. On the 3rd day, the sand changed character. It came away in those flat, compressed panes she had noticed before, horizontal sheets of packed grit that held together briefly before crumbling, as though the weight of many seasons had pressed them into a kind of reluctant order. She switched to the mattock then, working more slowly, each stroke deliberate. The hollow rang a little differently underfoot. She noticed this and said nothing, to no one, because there was no one to say anything to. On the fourth morning, in the earliest light, the mattock rang back. Not the dull thud of sand meeting iron. Something else, a clean, hard sound, resonant, the kind that travels up through the handle and into the palms, into the wrists, into the comprehension. She stopped. She set the mattock aside and crouched in the narrow excavation and reached down with both hands, brushing sand away in long, careful strokes, the way a woman might brush flour from a tabletop. Cedar plank, hand split, fitted close, still hard beneath 16 years of packed sandhill sand. She remained crouched over it for a long moment. The smell reached her then. Dry wood, old and sealed, the particular stillness of something that has been undisturbed so long it has become indistinguishable from the earth around it. Not rot, not ruin, preservation, accidental and complete. The cedar had given off enough of its own oils through the years to keep the sand above it honest, and the sand had kept the weather out, and the weather had never been invited in. She took up the mattock again and worked more carefully still. 2 more days. The door, when she finally uncovered its full frame, was set flush to the hillside and hinged with hand-forged iron that had not rusted through. She lifted the latch. It gave without protest. The iron stiff, yes, but not seized, not broken, only slow in the way of things that have been patient a long time and see no reason for haste. The door swung inward on its hinges with a sound that was almost nothing at all, a soft exhalation, as though the cellar had been holding its breath since 1876 and had only now decided to let it go. She stood at the threshold and struck a tallow candle to life and descended. The steps were 4, cut from the same cedar plank as the walls, and they held her weight without complaint. Below, the air met her like a hand laid flat against the face, cool, still, and absolute, the way only deep-buried things are cool in July, by no contrivance but depth and darkness, and the sandhill earth doing what sandhill earth does when it is left alone. Outside, the July sun was bending the dry grass nearly to the ground. Down here, it was another season entirely. She held the candle out before her and stood without moving. 30 feet of cellar resolved itself from the darkness in pieces. First, the cedar planking close along the walls, hand split and fitted with the kind of care a man takes when he believes he is building something that will outlast him, which it had. Then the shelving, 3 tiers running the full length on both sides, constructed from dry hardwood that had kept its straightness through 15 Nebraska winters without a single warp she could detect by candlelight. On those shelves, crockery, sealed with wax and lard cloth, most of it intact. Dry goods still in their paper wrappings, gone stiff and brown, but unbreached. A tin of salt that had caked solid, and then remained so, unmoved. At the far end, stacked with a neatness that spoke of a woman's hand in the arrangement, 4 wooden boxes of utensils wrapped in oilcloth, and beside them a small folded piece of woolen blanket, mouse-chewed at one corner, which was the only evidence in the whole space that anything alive had ever been inside it before. She sat on the bottom step for a very long time. She did not move to inventory the crockery, not yet. She did not begin the arithmetic that she knew was already forming itself in the back of her mind, patient and precise as it always was. She only sat and let the cool air settle around her, and held the candle, and looked at the length of it. 30 feet of cedar and dry goods, and another family's hope, preserved whole by the accident of good construction and dry climate, and the indifference of the sand above. In the winter of 1891, one of the neighboring farm wives, the same woman who had stood at the fence in April of 1889 and pressed her lips together in a silence that said everything pity can say, stood at the top of those same 4 cedar steps with a barrel of salted pork in her arms, waiting to be shown down. She did not sit long. The arithmetic, patient as she had trained it to be, would not wait past that first evening. She climbed back up the 4 cedar steps and walked to the lamp on the table and opened her ledger to a clean page. And by the time the candle had burned an inch, she had written down every figure she was certain of and left blank lines for the rest. 30 feet by 8, cedar plank, intact. Crockery, she would count it in the morning. The figures for what it might hold, and what holding things through winter might be worth to the families along the ridge road, who had no cold storage. Those figures she did not write yet. She only drew the outlines of them, the way a woman draws a pattern before she cuts the cloth. In the morning, she walked to the old German neighbor's fence and told him what she had found. He listened without expression, the way he always did, and when she had finished, he said only that the cedar had been well split, that the family who put it up had known what they were doing, and that the sand was the driest insulation a man could ask for if it sat over good, tight planking. He said nothing about having been right. She said nothing about it either. There was no occasion for it, and neither of them felt the lack. She wrote to the county land office the following week, a careful letter, brief and specific, the legal description of the parcel, the apparent original date of construction, the family name she had read on the back of one of the crocks, a Bohemian name, 2 words, the ink faded but legible. The response came in late August, 3 weeks on, and confirmed in flat bureaucratic language what she had already half known. The original claimants had relinquished all rights to the parcel in the spring of 1876, in the wake of the grasshopper plague, and no heir or successor had ever filed against it. Everything below her ground was hers, by lawful title, as fully as the sand above it and the sky above that. She borrowed the ox and the iron blade scraper from the neighbor 2 farms east, the one who kept a tight face when she had passed with the ferret crates in April, and spent 4 days clearing the remaining overburden from the cellar's full length. The ox was patient. The work was not pleasant. Sand is not heavy in single handfuls, but it is remorseless in volume, and by the second afternoon her shoulders had stopped reporting pain and gone to something duller and more general that she ignored by habit. She framed the door in salvaged lumber from a fence row that had gone down in the spring winds, mortised and pegged it square. The original homesteader's crockery she removed with deliberate care, piece by piece, wrapped each vessel in sacking, and stored it in the corner of her own lean-to, separate from her own goods, kept whole, as if the family might yet return for it. The frost came on the 14th of October, 1889, without the gradual warning that a merciful autumn sometimes gives. It came in a single night, hard and complete, laying itself over Cherry County like a judgment rendered without appeal. By morning, the sandhill grass stood rigid and silver, and the air carried that particular stillness that follows a killing cold. The stillness of things stopped mid-becoming. She walked the cellar's length that morning with a lantern, her breath hanging in small clouds, and took the measure of what she had. The interior temperature, even after the night's extremity, held steady and cool without being frozen. The packed sand above and the cedar walls, performing precisely the office that good construction and dry climate had always intended them to perform. She stood at the far end a long while, lantern raised, counting the cedar shelving, counting the feet of usable floor space, counting in the way she had learned to count everything, not with hope or dread, but with exactitude. By the end of that same week, she had spoken to 3 neighboring families who had been caught without adequate cold storage, 2 whose root pits had caved in the wet spring, 1 whose dugout cellar had flooded and never properly dried. She quoted them her terms plainly, $1 per barrel equivalent of stored goods for the full winter season, the goods to remain their own property and retrievable on reasonable notice. The terms were simple because she had no interest in complexity. She had interest in arithmetic. Within a fortnight, the cellar stood half full. Pork barrels, apple barrels, sealed crocks of sauerkraut and pickled beets, sacks of dried corn tied at the neck, the harvests of neighbors who had arrived with wagons, and some measure of sheepishness, and departed with something that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it. She entered each transaction in her ledger with the same hand she used for everything, level, unhurried, ink pressed clear to the page. It was the grain merchant who heard of it last among those of consequence, and who came to see for himself in the gray 3rd week of October. He drove his own rig up the ridge road and stood at the cellar door while she held it open, lantern in hand. He looked at the shelving, at the cedar walls, at the barrels stacked in their rows. He did not say much. She did not require him to. His expression was the kind that men wear when they have been presented with a fact that has overtaken an opinion they were not fully aware they held. He asked what she charged. She told him. He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is already calculating something privately. He did not rent space that October, but she noted his interest and noted it without comment. 2 winters hence, his name would appear on the ledger board beside the cellar door, 3rd from the top. The winter came without ceremony, as winters in the sandhills do, not all at once, but in increments, each cold morning a fraction more insistent than the last, until by December the ridge road was rutted hard as iron, and the sand itself seemed to have forgotten it had ever shifted. She kept the ledger through all of it. Every barrel entered in October was logged by family name, by contents, by date received and date to be collected. Every transaction was its own small paragraph of accountability, the kind of record-keeping that asks nothing of memory because it has already asked everything of ink. The cellar held. Through November's dry freeze and the hard weeks of January when the temperature dropped far enough to split green wood left standing in the yard, the temperature inside the cedar-lined chamber remained what it had been in autumn, cold enough to preserve, never cold enough to destroy. The packed sandhill sand above it was the reason, insulating as no timber frame wall ever managed to be. The original homesteader had understood this, or had stumbled upon it, which amounts to much the same thing in the long accounting of the land. In March, when her neighbors came to collect what they had stored, they found it unmarked by the winter, pork barrels sealed and sound, apple crocks intact. The woman who had pitied her in April, the one who had said quietly to the other that buying blind ferrets was a grief-addled choice, came up the ridge road with her husband and a borrowed sledge, and carried down what she had stored without spoilage or loss. She did not say much. She did not need to. The unmarked barrel spoke for the winter entire. On lower ground, there had been losses. A neighbor 2 miles south had kept his stores in a dug bank that wept moisture from February thaw, and lost a quarter of his put-up meat to mold. Another had trusted a hay-packed box cellar that froze solid in the last week of January. Word traveled across the ridge the way it always does in thinly settled country. Not as announcement, but as contrast. Neighbor telling neighbor what the ridge woman's cellar had held against what their own arrangements had failed to hold. The county assessor came in early April, officially. He rode up alone, dismounted, walked the length of the cellar with its door propped wide, and made his notations in the small bound book he carried for the purpose. When he read his revised assessment aloud, as the county required him to establish public record, the figure he named for the 60 acres was 4 times what it had been the previous spring. She entered that figure, too, in her ledger, not out of vanity, because it was true, and the ledger was where true things were kept. That spring, she hired labor for the first time. The old German neighbor's grandson was 17, broad through the shoulders already, and willing to work for fair wages rather than promises. She paid him 40 cents a day through July and into August, honest arithmetic, entered in the ledger alongside everything else. What she set him to was not glamorous work. A mattock, a spade, the same borrowed ox-drawn scraper that had cleared the first cellar's entrance 2 years prior. She had studied the original cellar's construction through the winter, the angle of the cedar planking, the depth of the sand cap above, the way the cold settled and stayed, and she understood now what the first homesteader had understood, without being able to say it plainly, that the sand itself was the insulation, and more sand above meant more cold held below. She wanted an antechamber, a second room, hand-dug off the north wall, 8 feet across, lined in cedar where the cedar could be had, and in cottonwood plank where it could not. By late August of 1890, it was finished. The addition nearly doubled her usable storage floor, though she noted in the ledger that it was not quite double. She was precise about such things, and would not round a figure in her own favor simply because the rounding was convenient. The 7 contracts came in through September of 1891, written in a plain hand on plain paper, witnessed where a witness was available, and signed where one was not. 7 families, 7 sets of stores to shelter against whatever winter chose to bring. The Ferrets by then numbered 38. Some had been lost to weather, a few to predation. A great horned owl had taken its toll on the younger animals across 2 seasons, and she had not replaced them, only watched the survivors grow sleek and unhurried in their cedar hutch beside the cellar door. They had become, in the particular way of things that cannot quite be explained, a kind of local fixture. Neighbors who came to arrange their storage contracts would pause at the hutch on the way out. They touched the cedar slats carefully, peered, through the gaps at the dark shapes breathing within. Nobody said precisely what they were thinking, but the question hung in the still autumn air nonetheless. How an animal's degraded nose had accomplished what 2 years of county assessments and merchant ledgers and experienced opinion had entirely failed to see. She did not explain it to them. She had no interest in explaining it. The old German had explained it already, 2 summers past, and the explanation had never been hers to give in any case. Autumn closed. The first hard frost came on the 14th of October, earlier than the almanac had suggested, later than she had privately expected. The cellar door was already latched. The 7 families' stores were already inside. December was coming. December came without ceremony. The snow began in the early morning, small and dry, the kind that does not announce itself but accumulates in the windward angles of fence posts and cedar slats, until, by midday, the ridge had gone white and quiet in all directions. He rode up the track in the early afternoon. She heard the horse before she saw him, the particular sound of iron shoes on frozen sand, a sound that carries differently in cold air, more clearly, as though the cold itself lends attention. She was at the cellar door, checking the latch seating against the new frost, and she did not move from where she stood as he came up the final rise and drew rein. He was older than she remembered, or the snow made him seem so. He sat his horse a moment, looking at the hand-lettered ledger board beside the door, the 7 names written in her careful, unornamented hand, the fees beside each, the barrel counts. He read it the way a man reads something he cannot quite make useful to him. Then he dismounted slowly and removed his hat. He said he had heard. He said he supposed anyone in the county had heard by now. He said, and he chose his words with more care than she had known him to use, in April of 1889, that he was prepared to offer a fair share of partnership in the operation if she was inclined. She was not inclined. She said it without heat and without pleasure. She said it the way one states a measurement, the way one reads a figure from a ledger and sets the pencil down. Then she took the lantern from its hook beside the door, lit it, and lifted the latch. She showed him the space. He stood in the entrance a long moment, holding his hat, letting his eyes find the dimensions, the 30 feet of cedar-planked wall, the dry shelving, the crockery on the high shelf still bearing the faint painted marks of the family who had sealed this place in 1876 and never returned. Below that, her own harvest. Below that, the stored goods of 7 families who had no other cold through a hard winter. He said nothing that she felt required an answer. After a time, he went back out into the snow, remounted, and rode down off the ridge. She latched the door. She picked up her ledger from the small table inside the entry and turned back to the column she had been working. Barrel count against remaining shelf space, projected through February. The ferrets moved in the cedar hutch. 38 of them, or near enough. Fat, unhurried, their ruined eyes half-lidded against the cold. Their noses had brought her here. The ground had always held the gift. It had only been waiting for someone willing to follow a blind animal home through the dark.